Hello my friends, it is the 6th of July 2016, Mr. Max Bliss in the southwest of France. This morning the sky was completely blue. There were no contrails visible, there were no persistent contrails, there were no clouds. But then the persistent contrails from some aircraft started to have an effect on the atmosphere. We started to see a hazing, we started to see the crystals spreading out, and then we started to see quite a lot of development of cumulus clouds. Now contrails are known to affect the atmosphere in different ways. They alter the electrical and thermal dynamics of the atmosphere. They also change humidity. They have some interesting effects with the contrails and contrail cirrus that actually contribute to global warming, so that if you have a region where you can deploy contrails or deliberately create contrails, which is where there is quite a strong argument for the chemtrail conspiracy theory, which I do subscribe to, that I do believe that contrails are being deliberately created as part of a global weather and climate modification program, which of course is covert and non-consensual. Now, what makes me so confident that I believe that they are deliberately creating contrails, or that the use of contrails with inadvertent weather modification is definitely a part of a wider agenda for controlling the weather and climate? Well, I want to read a paper to you which I find very, very interesting, and I think is highly relevant, and I think it explains quite a bit. Okay, so first of all, aeroplanes can contribute to global warming. That's just a little article there I pulled up on the internet. And if anyone wants to have a look at it, just do an internet search on contrails contribute to global warming, more so than the CO2 they eject in the exhaust. So that's one element, that contrails and contrail cirrus clouds actually contribute to global warming. So we're now seeing an increasingly cloudy planet, and we see regional warming, mostly where the aircraft are flying, where there's high density traffic. So that's a significant part that's often played down because of the political agenda for the uptake of sustainable development, which is the United Nations agenda for the 21st century, which in effect is giving or developing the foundations for global governance, and in effect creating the foundations for one world government. It's usurping national sovereignty with international treaties. The Sustainable Development Programme is literally about a global plan being implemented at a local level, which takes control of all resources, water supply, food supply, and shifts power to a joint public-private ownership, when it's not, none of it is private, it's public, because when they say the public element of that private-public partnership, we're talking about government. And the private is international corporations. So we're looking at an amalgamation, a consolidation of control through sustainable development into the hands of international government or governance and corporations. So we're looking at a takeover, because we know all the governments are really run as a puppet facade, with the oligarchy as the string pullers. We're talking about the obscenely rich oligarchy that really attend all the Bilderberg groups, the Council on Foreign Relations, the trilateral organisations, the Trilateral Commission, the Royal Institute on International Affairs, all these massive organisations, the Bilderberg group, I said already, but basically the oligarchy really are the ones that control governments and implement policies and through their think tank organisations. So we're seeing a gradual tiptoe takeover of the entire world basically because of the threat of climate change, or global warming more specifically. So, contrails or chemtrails are constituents being added deliberately to create contrails. It's entirely possible. It's been very, very well researched, and there are many different techniques or materials that could be added to create these contrails. There are patents for stopping contrails. Here's quite a relevant one, I think. It's a moisture dispersion from Rolls-Royce, and this uses various different techniques they describe. It's not just one technique, but the technique which is of interest to me is one where they ionize to create ice seeds, ice crystals, to seed the contrail to be able to stop it. So you've got a technique then, which is relatively easy, for stopping and starting and deploying where you want your contrail. Here is another paper which is very, very worthwhile trying to find and look. It's about the sulfur content of the fuel and the effects on contrails. And the reason I say that is so important is because I have attended various different climate change and climate engineering conferences, and one of the repeated materials is sulfur, is aluminium oxide nanoparticles, is titanium, is nanotubes, carbon black, coal, diamond dust, all various different types of materials. But sulfur is the one that is quite important because it is in fuel anyway. And it would be very, very easy to add enriched sulfur fuel. And one of the professors at the Cambridge Solar Radiation Management Conference, Dr. Stephen Salter, whom I was speaking with, confirmed that these planes flying, which would be involved in solar radiation management, only need to have a bucket full of material to add to the exhaust or the fuel in order to be deliberately making contrails that would expand out and create the solar shield to reduce the amount of sunlight coming in and thereby cool the planet, if that was their process. But that was in the stratosphere. Down in the troposphere, it would have a net warming effect, or all these extra contrails would have a warming effect. And there are other elements to this, of course, like damaging the ozone, increasing the amount of UV radiation hitting the surface and the damage that would cause. That's from normal everyday flights. But I want to actually stick with contrails because it's such a controversial issue with the contrail conspiracy. I do subscribe to the idea that they are deliberately creating these contrails as part of a large-scale weather and climate modification program. And one of the areas which is often overlooked, apart from the warming that can happen because the contrails are serious, is the seeding effect of contrails. So what I'm going to do with you is read a paper. It's only a 4-page paper, but it helps to explain the effects that contrails can have. Now, bear in mind that contrails now, there's various different patents about being able to stop or suppress a contrail, which means that you have the ability to deploy where you want it to. And this can be done by remote control, by computers. And if you don't understand yet, all jet aircraft engines are monitored in real time by computers. Rolls-Royce and Pratt & Whitney and the General Electric engines are all monitored. So there's an interaction with computers with all planes flying. Okay, so on to the paper about how, well, I'll read the paper and you can make your own mind up. This is from October 1970. On the possibility of weather modification by aircraft, contrails, Wallace B. McRae from the Geophysical Institute, University of Alaska. Okay, there's a copy of it, so you can see, so you can search for that and get that down yourself. The possible effect of contrails in modifying the weather is reconsidered in the light of information obtained from ground level contrails in Alaska. It appears likely that inadvertent cloud seeding by jet aircraft may be the same order of magnitude as that attained in commercial cloud seeding operations. Further investigation is needed, but in the meantime the possibility of contrail contamination should be kept in mind when evaluating the results of commercial cloud seeding operations. Introduction. Aircraft contrails first attracted public attention during World War II, but as air traffic has built up to its present level, they have come to be accepted as part of the environment. Even during World War II, it was difficult to watch the cloud cover laid down by a large bomber formation without wondering what it might be doing to the weather. At present, there is widespread belief among the general public and some feeling among scientists. Fletcher, 1969, Rainmaking, 1968, Livingstone, 1969, Schaefer, 1969, that contrails are increasing cloudiness, if nothing more in some regions. The writer himself has seen instances in which a single contrail seemed to grow until it became overcast, covering the whole sky. If the contrail were indeed responsible, which is by no means certain, this would constitute definite proof that contrails are capable of a significant effect on local weather and even possibly on global climate. If such occurrences are widespread and are frequent, it seems worthwhile, in view of all of this, to consider quantitatively whether or not there is reason to believe contrails are capable of exerting a significant influence on weather. 2. Observations on the composition of the contrail. Any quantitative discussion should start with the contrail itself. A medium-sized jet airliner, the Boeing 727 to be specific, burns 3,100 kilograms of fuel per hour while cruising, producing over 1.2 times as much water vapour than a kilogram per second. It is this water that forms the contrail, and a discussion on the basic processes by which it does so was given by Appleman in 1953. His discussion also gave a fairly accurate description of the conditions under which a contrail will be formed, but did not discuss the nature of the contrail particles further than to specify they are ice crystals. Some attempts have been made to sample the contrail particles in flight, but there is always scepticism as to how well the particles collected under such circumstances represent those in the contrail. During the winters of interior Alaska, however, conditions are frequently such that a contrail is left while the aircraft is taxiing and taking off or landing, so that it is easily accessible for study. On the ground, the contrail is called ice fog, and it can become a serious problem in flight operations. This discussion is based on observations made under direction of Otake 1967 and Huffman 1967 during the course of investigations of ice fog from this and other sources. As a result of these observations, enough is known about the way a contrail is formed to make it safe to state that the contrail formed at cruising altitude is very unlikely to differ greatly from that formed on the ground. Ephemeral contrails are of no particular interest here, although a great deal can be learned about conditions in the atmosphere by observing their formation and disappearance. The discussion will therefore be limited to those formed while the aircraft is cruising at atmosphere, at least saturated with respect to ice, and at temperature approximately minus 40 degrees centigrade or lower. When the jet exhaust enters such an atmosphere, it is very rapidly cooled by expansion and turbulent mixing, and the water vapour condenses in the form of very small water droplets. Although the cooling is so rapid that levels of supersaturation at which homogeneous nucleation could take place should be reached, electron microscope photographs of the crystals shows no evidence that this ever happens. The droplets all appear to form on nuclei, which are abundantly provided by the exhaust products, even if not otherwise present. The liquid droplet phase is very short-lived, of the order of a second, since the ambient atmosphere below the spontaneous freezing threshold. The droplets freeze and the result is a cloud composed mainly of small, roughly spherical crystals called droxtals by the Stanford group who first reported on them, Thurman and Robinson, 1954. The time before the cloud is completely frozen is much too short to allow mass exchange to take place between liquid droplets or between liquid drops and ice crystals, but there may be some crystal growth while the environment is between water and ice saturation. The end result seems to be dependent mainly upon ambient temperature and little upon details of the way the exhaust enters the atmosphere. The ice fog produced by an automobile exhaust being practically identical to that of the jet engine, one therefore feels quite confident in using the results of the ground observations to discuss the contrail formed at cruise altitude. Nearly 80% of the crystals collected near the airport runway had a diameter of 4 microns. Well, that's like a little U with a tail on it. That's the symbol. All collection methods are open to suspicion of weighting in favour of larger particles. Furthermore, very small particles would not have been detected at all. Many of the crystals collected show evidence of having ruptured, emitting a spurt of water as they froze from the outside in. Bally-Dorsey effect, Blanchard, 1951, in brackets. This may have produced crystals too small to be detected, though there is no evidence of that effect. At any rate, assuming spherical shape and 2 microns, I hope I got that right, it's a tiny little U. I don't know if you can see that, it's a tiny little U, so I may be wrongly describing that symbol, but I'm going to say sub-microns. It's tiny. Radius gives a average reciprocal mass of approximately 3 to 10 to the power of 10 droxtals gm to the power of -1, which is believed to be a very conservative lower limit. 3. Contrail crystals as a freezing nuclei. A cruising Boeing 727 then produces 3 times 10 to the power of 13 crystals, sec -1, if all the water vapour produced by the fuel combustion goes into crystal formation, as probably happens under the stated condition, or 10 to the power of 13 if only a third of it does. The writer feels that the actual crystal production rate is probably at least 10 to the power of 14 and possibly 10 to the power of 15. This seems to be confirmed by the area and optical depth of the contrail. Except for hail suppression operations, large-scale weather modification attempts currently in progress, this is 1970, employ ground-based generators to introduce freezing nuclei into the atmosphere. Under these conditions, silver iodide, the nucleating material most generally used, is considered to deliver 10 to the power of 13 freezing nuclei of silver iodide on average. Under optimum conditions, it may deliver as many as 10 to 15 nuclei. Under adverse conditions, it may deliver none at all. Since silver iodide nuclei deteriorate rapidly in effectiveness after entering the atmosphere, it can be seen then that a medium-sized jet forming a persistent contrail is introducing nuclei in numbers equivalent to ground-based generators, burning more than a gram of silver per second of silver iodide. Since silver iodide is introduced with the object of forming ice crystals from supercooled water droplets, it seems obvious that contrail ice crystals can produce any effect of which silver iodide nuclei are capable, and in addition can do things of which silver iodide is not likely to be capable, such as extracting water from the air, from air supersaturated over ice but under water saturation. Silver iodide apparently can be effective in the absence of water droplets by acting first as a condensation and later as a freezing nucleus, but there seems to be some doubt about how effective it is. It is evident that whenever and wherever persistent contrails are being produced, the airlines are conducting a seeding operation in which each passing aircraft deposits nuclei in numbers at least comparable to ground-based seeding attempts. The coverage is global in extent, and while random in the sense that airline flights are not scheduled with weather modification in mind, it is not really random with respect to meteorological conditions. Airline operations are affected by the weather, and such things as pressure pattern navigation, for instance, could well introduce a significant bias. The formation of a persistent contrail is itself a function of ambient conditions that would seem to lead to the crystals being deposited preferentially in situations favourable to modifications of the weather being produced. 4. Modification by processes other than seeding. The contrail crystals are so small that they fall very slowly in still air. Even at jet cruising altitudes and in the presence of even slight updrafts will not fall at all. Under some conditions, it seems likely that they can accumulate sufficiently to cause some high cloudiness along busy airway, even if they remain essentially unchanged in size and numbers after they are first introduced. This, however, seems to be marginal, and it is unlikely that simple accumulation, even if accompanied by modest growth, is causing much effect at present. But that's 1970. There is, however, good reason to believe that some mechanism exists that results in crystal multiplication. Careful observation of contrails shows that in general their behaviour is consistent with the high rates of crystal production given in discussion above. But in many instances the contrails attain dimensions that are very difficult to explain by simple growth of existing crystals, unless the numbers given here are very gross underestimates. The crystals in the contrails that exhibited this behaviour were obviously growing very rapidly, since well-defined fall streaks developed from them in less than half an hour, so they were evidently in air highly supersaturated with respect to ice. Natural air can become very much more highly supersaturated with respect to ice than it ever does with respect to water because of the very low content of nuclei capable of removing water vapour from the air once it is below water saturation. It is obvious that if contrail crystals really did produce the complete sky coverage in the instances mentioned in the introduction, some rapid and efficient process of crystal production must have been triggered. It is quite evident that systematic and quantitative observation of contrails can lead to a considerable increase in our knowledge of the meteorology of the 200 to 300 MB region of cloud physics in general, in addition to the value of such observation in connection with the subject in this paper. 5. General discussion and inferences. It has been shown above that there is good reason to believe that aircraft contrails may be capable of considerable weather modification. by producing cirrus clouds at altitudes close to those at which aircraft are cruising. It is obvious that contrail crystals influence cumulus cloud development by getting into clouds that extend to and beyond normal jet cruising levels. A little reflection will show that there is good reason to believe that contrail crystal seeding may be producing all the effects of which deliberate seeding with freezing nuclei is capable. Crystals falling from cirrus clouds through what appear to have been at least moderately dry air have been observed to survive for astonishing distances. In brackets, Braham and Spires-Duran, 1967, end brackets. The contrail crystals must grow considerably before they fall, but they are frequently seen to develop respectable fall velocities within a few minutes after they are formed. Whether or not they are capable of surviving a long fall through dry air, it is likely they are often deposited in the air that is saturated with respect to ice, all the way from altitude of formation to the cloud bases. Under such conditions, they will, of course, at least survive to melting level, and it is likely that they will grow and possibly multiply. Under such conditions, they can enter clouds anywhere above the freezing level and possibly for some distance below. In brackets, it is difficult to see how they could be injected into a cloud in a manner that would exactly duplicate the conditions of cloud seeding flight through it, or a silver iodide shell exploded in it, but not so difficult to see how the contrail crystals might produce essentially the same results. End brackets. It is not intended here to undertake an exhaustive discussion of the possible effects of cloud seeding by contrail crystals, but one or two possibilities seem worth mentioning. The orographic cloud situation in which a wet air mass is being driven upward over a mountain range is considered to be one of the more favourable for increasing precipitation by ground-based silver iodide seedings. This situation, however, leads to an air mass that is rising and cooling over a region that extends for a considerable distance upwind and to altitudes well beyond those at which airliners normally cruise. It is likely, therefore, that air will be at or near saturation, at least over ice, from the cloud base up, and that a persistent contrail will be formed that can and will seed the clouds. When one considers the number of air flights over an area such as the west of Denver, Colorado, one immediately wonders what the airlines may be doing to the statistics used in evaluating the results of commercial seeding. In brackets, it should be noted that the writer is not contending that either or both operations actually do increase precipitation. He is merely pointing out that both should be considered. End brackets. The plains region of the United States is traversed by heavy air traffic in summer. It is also heavily populated by towering cumulus, so that a jet aircraft is often flying among them. The flight path rarely goes through the clouds because of the turbulence and the likelihood of encountering hail, but the whole region is likely to be saturated with respect to ice. The air is also likely to contain considerable numbers of natural ice crystals, so it is not immediately obvious that the introduction of contrail crystals can have any effect. However, while riding an aircraft through this region, one sees numerous contrails left by other flights. So it is evident that the natural ice crystal concentrations are much exceeded along the flight path, and this that this condition persists for some time. Schaefer, 1969, mentions this in his discussion in discussing inadvertent weather modifications. He implies the seeding capabilities, but does not discuss them specifically. The probability that a developing thunderhead will entrain such a high ice crystal concentration is thus increased, and a little calculation shows that, if the Russians and the French are right, it could lead to the suppression of destructive hail. There seems little doubt that contrail crystal seeding sometimes disperses clouds in the same manner as seeding with dry ice does. Over the years, many instances of cloud dispersal by aircraft have been reported in italics weather, which I believe is a journal, and many very good photographs have been published. In most instances, not enough data are available to form a firm opinion of how the dispersal was accomplished, but the resemblance of the photographs and descriptions of the occurrences to those of the results of seeding super-cooled water clouds with dry ice is so striking that it seems safe to conclude that most, if not all, of the reports are examples of the seeding of clouds by contrail ice crystals. The possible consequences of this are considerable. In fact, it seems probable that one of the projects for modifying the global climate discussed by Fletcher in 1965, namely modification of cloud cover over the North Polar Basin by cloud seeding, is already underway, although the scale is still more modest than he had envisioned. 6. Conclusions. The conclusions reached as a result of the above discussion are that nearly all results that can be produced by seeding with ice crystals are in fact being produced as the result of routine air operations. That the effectiveness of ice crystals as nuclei over such a wide range of meteorological conditions and the scale on which they are being deposited make it likely that they are affecting precipitation to a much greater extent than our present deliberate seeding operations, although the deliberate operations may still show more net results of the selection of situations suitable for seeding. It cannot be concluded that any net effects are necessarily being produced even on local climates, although it seems certain that seeding is taking place, because the possible results of any kind of seeding are not well understood at present, and because the very massiveness and frequency of the seeding makes it likely such a profusion of effects in contradictory directions is being produced that the net result may be small. The actual magnitude and direction of the effect on the weather can only be established by analysis of the records. The purpose of this paper is to show that there is a sound basis for suspicion that contrails may be influencing the weather, and that it is important to find out if they are. In conclusion, it should be stated that if contrails are affecting the weather, it is not necessarily for the worse. Although if there are a considerable change, it is sure to make someone unhappy. The Russians might well be pleased with an ice-free Arctic Ocean. But if it leads to major glaciation in central Canada, it is likely that the Canadians or Americans would regard this as favourable. And there's a list of references that he's used there. Hopefully that'll come out. Now, I wanted to read that and share that with you because I'm going to have a quick look at the sky, and look, you can see these are contrail cirrus clouds that have been made because of aircraft flying. And as we've just read, it is known, or highly likely, that these ice crystals are just as effective as commercial seeding operations for the purposes of weather modification, be it to disperse clouds, be it to increase cloud cover, or to trap in the warm air to create regional warming, or whatever process they might be doing. What we're talking about is contrails are having an effect on weather. Now, that's not the only example that I have found to suggest this. There is a number of publications about this. It is easy to create contrails, whether you're spraying water vapour into the exhaust, whether you're adding a little bit of sulphur, whether you're adding aluminium oxide nanoparticles by combusting alumina. There are numerous other methods. There are methods to seed the sky beforehand so that when the planes are flying through, they're more likely to create these contrails. So what I'm trying to allude to here is it's not that difficult for large-scale weather modification involving contrails, whether they are deliberate or inadvertent. But this particular area is played down deliberately by the establishment, which is being steered to blame changes in weather and climate on the global warming issue. Now, I'd like to state that according to the IPCC, total global warming from 1880 to 2012 was just 0.8 centigrade, not even 1 degrees. Now, officially, the Little Ice Age, which was quite bitterly cold, sufficiently for the River Thames in London to freeze over and for there to be frost fairs, ended in 1850. So what we are looking at is natural variance. According to the IPCC, we have not warmed more than 1 degree since the Little Ice Age. That's perfectly normal. So there's no need to be alarmed, but the political drive for creating a public acceptance of their big plans, like the United Nations Agenda 21, would suggest a very important motivation for the use of the military-industrial complex to develop the techniques for large-scale weather and climate modification to be used to create weather extremes, to create local regional warming, to create an increase in cloud cover or a decrease in cloud cover, to create droughts, to create floods, in a managed way, even if it's using inadvertent weather modification or deliberate techniques to create that weather modification using contrails. And if they are deliberately creating them, then that would, by introducing chemicals like additional sulphur, then that would be a chemtrail. What we're looking at is a concerted agenda to manufacture consent from the public for the uptake and global acceptance of the United Nations Sustainable Development Programme, which lays the foundation for global governance. It usurps national sovereignty. It creates the foundations for a one world government. It transfers custodianship and power of a nation's resources to the United Nations under the guise of better management for climate change. And I believe that this is the main motivation. This is using the agenda, the arena, the issues of climate change to manufacture consent from the public under false grounds for the development of this global governance that will be necessary to develop the foundations for one world government. This is why it's really important that people need to do their research and start looking at different papers, trying to understand how much effort has gone into, there's one there for the method to produce cumulus clouds from the US government, this one. This one's from 1951 from Vincent Schaefer on making ice crystals for weather modification. We need to understand how long this interest in controlling the weather and climate is. This goes back time immemorial really, but the serious scientific framework for the real processes of weather and climate modification have been developed for well over 100 years, and has certainly been developed for possibly 200 years. So it's a very long-term agenda, and in my view this whole climate change agenda is about developing the public awareness of a potential global threat, so that people will begin to allow global governance to take over our lives. Now I want to read a quick quote before I finish this, and thank you so much for if you've got this far in sticking with me. This is a quote from The First Global Revolution. It's a book called The First Global Revolution by a think tank organisation called the Club of Rome. This was set up by David Rockefeller and a number of other people as a think tank organisation to offer advice to the United Nations and other organisations. So the quote I want to read you is from the Club of Rome. In 1991, the club published the book called The First Global Revolution. According to this book, divided nations require common enemies to unite them. Either a real one or else one invented for the purpose. Because of the sudden absence of traditional enemies, i.e. we've had most of the major wars, and it's moving to a post-war era on the planet because basically all the nations have been conquered, and regime change means that puppet governments are all installed, so it's now the next method to control society. New enemies must be identified. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. So that's from the Global Revolution. So what they're doing there is trying to create a public license to dominate mankind, because they're trying to suggest that mankind is the enemy itself, even though it's completely fabricated. And of course there will be some strains of truth there, because mankind is being led astray. Consumerism and throwaway society has been coerced and developed deliberately to create the throwaway attitude, but with a mass market saturation with cheap Chinese rubbish goods that get damaged. That's all been engineered by the oligarchy to firstly for deindustrialization, so that the West becomes less powerful, there's more austerity, there's a huge unemployment, but also these cheaper products change our habits, and they're not particularly good quality, so they're throwaway. So we moved from high quality goods that would last a long time to, oh no, we need to build in obsolescence, we need to make things that don't last to save jobs, and we've moved to these cheaper Asian products by design, in order to change society so that society can be blamed for their consumerism, for their throwaway attitude. But in actual fact, that's been coerced and developed. So the custodians of our planet, these oligarchy that set up these foundations, are manipulating society, social engineering, in order to set us up into a trap. so that we will feel guilty, so that we will assume responsibility. But we're forgetting who is guiding society, who is destroying the marketplace and transferring the jobs to Southeast Asia, who is then responsible for the negative impacts of the industrializations of Asia, the huge amount of transport necessary for shipping these goods all around the planet. Who? It's not you and I. It's not the everyday people. The oligarchy know what they're doing. This is deliberate. And in fact, the ships sailing all around the place started to have extra sulfur added to the marine diesel in 1967 following the US Clean Air Act. There's a fact for you. Ship tracks were not seen by satellite until 1968, although we have images, satellite images from 1960. And the only reason we started to see these ship tracks, which play a big role in climate modification and weather modification, is because of the extra sulfur from 1968 onwards. 1967 was the Clean Air Act that had to reduce the amount of sulfur in road traffic fuel, road fuel, but that was transferred to the marine diesel, told to me by Dr. Stephen Salter again. Thank you, Dr. Stephen Salter. So we have to understand that we are all being manipulated. Society is being manipulated. It's being steered, coerced, directed towards this United Nations Sustainable Development Plan, which is to be implemented globally at a local level with no one left behind. It's being the consent for this is being manufactured by Covert, weather and climate modification, and this is appalling. This is about setting up a totalitarian one world government, the post-democratic era, where we will become slaves and they will manage us using emerging technology. They would plan to use transhumanism, where they put implants inside our bodies, where they'll alter us, where even the food we eat will have nanotechnology in it, where there will be technology, that mass communication, there will be smart plants, there will be driverless cars, there will be complete monitoring wherever we go, face recognition, voice recognition, iris scans. I mean, we're moving into a total full spectrum dominance situation where basically the oligarchy are creating a framework for the total enslavement of mankind. Total control of the entire planet. Now, they will even control when people can conceive a child. They want to sterilise men so that it will move to the point that the only way we can have children is by IVF, and then they can start manipulating the future populations. They're already now in the UK, there's going to be IVF babies born with multiple parents, which I find highly disturbing. Basically, the oligarchy is trying to synthesize nature for their own personal goals of total control, and it's absolutely appalling. It's disgraceful, it's repugnant, it's horrifying, and it can be stopped, but the only way it will be stopped is when enough people decide enough is enough, get informed, inform other people, fan the fires of discontent and dissent. It's important we realise that we must take back power, change the system of governance to a system of self-governance with transparent mechanisms of direct democracy, which is not used. We have a system of fake democracy where we elect puppeticians or politicians to represent us, but they never represent us. They represent the goals of big corporations and essentially the oligarchy. The political parties are all controlled by the big banksters, and basically our system of democracy is a joke. It's a charade, a Punch and Judy charade. It's just used to keep the populations from revolution. But there are alternatives, and that would be direct democracy, where everyone gets to vote on all the issues through public referendum. There's open voting, so there's no vote rigging done anymore. We declare who we are, how we voted, our address, so that we can check see how the vote was counted, so we know that the votes aren't being rigged anymore. We need a transparent system so that this oligarchy can no longer take over the world. We need to take back the world and develop a world that is fair, that helps everybody, that doesn't give this oligarchy complete control, in fact relinquishes their control and passes it to the people. And I'm not talking about communism. There will be a socialist aspect to it because we want to return a lot of our resources and a lot of our power to the people, but only to the limits where we gain control of it, you know, for the benefit of the people. I'm not saying that we should get rid of all commerce, but obviously we need to reduce the power of these banks which have been abusing their position. We need to rid ourselves of the power of central banking and start issuing our own money nationally and working with cooperation between nations. We don't have to have a one world government. Democracy, according to the oligarchy, is the obstacle for their domination of the world. But we've never really had democracy, so we need to explore how we can get real democracy, or direct democracy as it's also called, and how that can be implemented with as least disruption as possible, but with as much transparency, so that we can really see a system developed for self-governance. I know I've covered a lot of information, and thank you so much if you've stayed with me on this, and if you like what I'm doing, please subscribe, like, and tell as many people as possible. Help them to develop the habit of doing their own research, finding out this information for yourself, and breaking the apathy, because we really must become the change we want to see. We have to be the change we want to see, because it's up to us. We've been conditioned to accept what the experts provided by government or the establishment say. Well, now we need to realise actually they're often wrong, they're often coerced, they're often influenced by funding, by what the establishment wants to promote. They're not entirely honest. So we need to find out for ourselves. We can no longer depend on the experts provided by the establishment. We need to find out the information for ourselves. The information is out there, so you just have to go and look for it. You have to find it. Unfortunately, there's so many more people waking up now than ever before. A lot of people are finding it. So you've got to do it. It's up to you. All of us. We've got to do what we can. Take care, my friends. Bye for now.